Did God really choose Israel? Gilles Deleuze explained it without filters. The autumn rain hammered against the windows of Temple Beth Shalom in Brooklyn, each drop echoing through the empty sanctuary like doubts Rabbi David Goldstein couldn't silence. At 52, he had spent 3 decades interpreting sacred texts, but tonight, surrounded by mahogany pews and the fading scent of Friday's roses, he felt like a fraud. The yellow streetlights outside cast long shadows across the Torah scrolls, and David found himself questioning everything he'd taught about divine election. "We are the chosen people," he whispered to the darkness, his voice cracking. But what did that even mean anymore? The phone buzzed. Sarah, his daughter, calling from her apartment in Williamsburg. "Dad, I can't sleep. I keep thinking about our conversation yesterday." Sarah was 28, a philosophy professor at NYU who specialized in continental thought. She had inherited her father's restless mind, but rejected his faith. Their weekly dinners had become intellectual battlegrounds, especially since she'd started teaching Deleuze. "The idea of being chosen is just another form of arborescent thinking, Dad," she had said over Chinese takeout the night before. "It creates hierarchies, fixed identities, you versus them, sacred versus profane. It's exactly what Deleuze warned against." Now holding the phone, David could hear the city's endless hum through her window, sirens, traffic, the metropolitan machine that never sleeps. "Come over," he said. "I think I'm having a crisis of faith." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood in the temple doorway, her dark hair damp from the rain. She wore the same concerned expression she'd had as a child when finding injured birds in Prospect Park. "Dad, you look terrible." They sat in the front pew, the same one where David's grandfather had prayed after fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. The weight of generational faith pressed down on them both. "I've been reading your Deleuze," David admitted, "trying to understand why my own daughter thinks everything I believe is, what did you call it? Fascistic." "I never used that word about your faith specifically," Sarah said gently. "But Dad, think about it. The notion of chosenness creates what Deleuze calls molar lines, rigid structures that segment reality into us and them, chosen and unchosen. It territorializes identity around exclusion." David ran his fingers along the worn prayer book in his lap. "But without some structure, some meaning, what are we? Just random particles bouncing around Brooklyn? Not random, rhizomatic, connected in ways we can't predict or control." Sarah's eyes lit up with the passion she usually reserved for her lectures. "Dad, your congregation isn't chosen because of some ancient contract with God. They're connected to each other, to you, to this neighborhood, to thousands of years of stories and struggles. That's not hierarchy, that's multiplicity." Outside, the rain intensified, turning the windows into abstract paintings of light and shadow. David thought about his congregants, Mrs. Chen, who converted after marrying into the community, young Marcus, whose grandmother had survived Auschwitz, the Goldberg twins, who questioned everything but still showed up every Shabbat. Were they chosen or had they chosen? Was there a difference? "But if we're not special," David said, "if we're just part of some vast rhizome, then what happened to us means nothing. The Holocaust, the exile, the return, just random historical events." Sarah took his hand. "Dad, that's not what I'm saying. Those experiences matter intensely. They created connections, resistances, new ways of being. But they don't make Jews inherently superior to anyone else. They make us part of a complex web of becoming." "Becoming what?" "I don't know, that's the point. We're not fixed identities moving toward predetermined destinations. We're processes, always changing, always connecting to new possibilities." David stared at the eternal flame above the ark, its steady glow unchanged for decades. "Your mother would have hated this conversation," he said softly. "Rebecca had died 5 years ago, taking with her a faith so pure it needed no philosophy." "Mom believed in love," Sarah replied, "and love, according to Deleuze, is about creating new connections, new becomings. Maybe that's what chosenness really means. Not that we're better, but that we're called to keep choosing, keep connecting, keep becoming something more than we were." The rain began to soften, and through the clearing windows, they could see the first hints of dawn over the East River. Sarah's apartment in Williamsburg reflected her philosophical bent. Books stacked in seemingly random piles that actually formed their own logic. Plants growing in converted coffee cans. Walls covered with maps of cities she'd never visited. The morning after her conversation with her father, she sat at her kitchen table grading papers while NPR played softly in the background. The news was the usual litany of global tensions, but one story made her pause. Violence erupted again in Gaza overnight as Israeli forces responded to rocket attacks. The conflict, rooted in competing claims to the same land, shows no signs of resolution. She turned off the radio and stared at her half-finished coffee. In 3 hours, she would face 30 undergraduate students for her seminar on Deleuze and political philosophy. How could she explain the concept of territorial assemblages when her own people were locked in what seemed like eternal warfare over territory? Her phone buzzed, a text from her colleague, Dr. Amara Hassan, a Palestinian professor in the history department. Coffee, need to talk. They met at their usual spot, a small cafe in Fort Greene that served excellent Turkish coffee and minded its own business. Amara was 45, elegant in the way of women who had learned to navigate American academia while carrying the weight of displacement. Her family had fled Palestine in 1967, settling eventually in Detroit, where her father had worked in auto plants until his death. "I heard your conversation with Rabbi Goldstein last week," Amara said, settling into the cracked leather booth. "Word travels fast in academic circles." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Which conversation?" "The one where he asked if Palestinian claims to the land were equally valid, and you said yes." The cafe hummed with the morning rush, college students hunched over laptops, construction workers grabbing quick breakfasts, the eternal rhythm of Brooklyn mornings. Sarah stirred her coffee slowly, watching the cream spiral into fractal patterns. "Did I say something wrong?" "That's what I want to understand," Amara said. "Because for my family, for my students, this isn't theoretical. When you apply Deleuzian concepts to Palestine-Israel, what does that actually mean for people who have lost homes?" Sarah felt the familiar tension between abstract philosophy and lived reality. Deleuze would say that both claims create what he calls striated space, territory organized by power, marked by exclusion. But underneath that there's smooth space, the nomadic potential for new forms of organization. "Nomadic," Amara repeated bitterly. "You know, my grandfather was literally a nomad. Bedouin. The Israelis settled him in a concrete village and told him it was progress." The words hung between them like smoke. Sarah realized she was treading on ground where her philosophical abstractions met someone else's concrete loss. But something in Amara's tone suggested this wasn't an attack. It was an invitation to think more carefully. "Tell me about him," Sarah said. Amara's expression softened. "Abu Mahmoud. He used to say that the land belongs to whoever can read its moods, where to find water, which plants meant good grazing, how to navigate by stars. For him, territory wasn't about ownership, but about relationship." "That sounds like what Deleuze calls becoming nomad," Sarah said carefully. "Not being nomadic, but thinking nomadically, creating new relationships with space, refusing fixed hierarchies." "But Abu Mahmoud was forced off his land. Where's the liberation in that?" Sarah set down her cup, thinking of her father's temple, of the Ark containing scrolls that spoke of another promised land, another displacement. Maybe the tragedy isn't that he lost territory, but that the concept of exclusive territory made his way of relating to land impossible. "You're saying the problem isn't Jewish settlement, but the idea of settlement itself. I'm saying both peoples are trapped in what Deleuze calls a despotic machine, a system that forces identity into rigid oppositions, Jewish versus Arab, chosen versus unchosen, historical claim versus historical claim. But what if there were other ways to organize relationship to land?" Amara leaned forward. "In theory, that's beautiful. In practice, my cousin's house was demolished last month to make room for settlements. How does becoming nomad help him?" The question struck Sarah like cold water. She thought about her students, safe in their classroom, parsing philosophical concepts while real people lost real homes. But she also thought about her father, wrestling with faith in an empty synagogue, and about her own position as a Jewish intellectual, critiquing Jewish claims. "I don't know," she admitted, But I know that the current machine, the one that says land must belong exclusively to one people or another, is producing endless suffering. Maybe Abu Mahmoud's way of reading the land's moods is a line of flight from that machine." Amara smiled for the first time that morning. You know what he would have said? That philosophers talk too much and listen too little, but he also would have said that talking is sometimes the beginning of new listening. They sat in comfortable silence, watching Brooklyn wake up around them. Through the window, Sarah could see Orthodox Jewish men walking to morning prayers, their black coats stark against the autumn leaves. Down the block, a halal cart was setting up for the lunch rush. The city was a machine too, she realized, but one that somehow made space for multiplicity. "What are you teaching today?" Amara asked. "Deterritorialization," Sarah said, "the process by which fixed territories break down and new possibilities emerge. Think they'll understand it? Probably not, but maybe that's okay. Maybe understanding isn't the point. Maybe it's about creating new questions." As they parted ways, Sarah felt something shifting in her own thinking. Philosophy wasn't just about elegant concepts. It was about creating new tools for living differently. The question was whether those tools could handle the weight of history, the reality of power, the urgency of suffering. Marcus Williams sat in the back row of Sarah's seminar, his notebook filled with doodles instead of notes. At 19, he was the youngest student in the class and the only black face in a room dominated by privileged white kids who threw around terms like assemblage and rhizome with casual confidence. His grandmother, Esther Williams, had converted to Judaism in 1962, but Marcus felt like he existed in the spaces between categories, too Jewish for some, too black for others, too working class for NYU's philosophy department. "So who can tell me what Deleuze means by lines of flight?" Professor Goldstein asked, perching on the edge of her desk in that informal way that was supposed to make students feel comfortable. The usual suspects raised their hands. Emma from the Upper East Side, whose father was a hedge fund manager, Tyler, who wrote his papers on his MacBook Pro in a coffee shop in Soho, Priya, whose parents were doctors in New Jersey and who approached philosophy like a medical diagnosis. "It's about escaping fixed identities," Emma said confidently, "breaking free from societal expectations and creating new possibilities for becoming." Marcus almost laughed. Easy to talk about escaping fixed identities when you'd never had your identity questioned at every turn. Easy to celebrate fluid boundaries when the boundaries had always protected you. But Professor Goldstein caught his eye. "Marcus, what do you think? You look skeptical." 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him. Marcus felt his chest tighten, the familiar sensation of being made visible when he preferred to observe. But something in the professor's expression reminded him of his grandmother, who had never let him hide when difficult conversations needed to happen. "I think it's complicated," he said slowly. "I mean, for some people, having a fixed identity is survival. My grandmother used to say that being black and Jewish wasn't about escaping categories, but about proving you belonged in both." The room grew quiet. Even Tyler looked up from his laptop. Professor Goldstein nodded. "Tell us more about that." Marcus thought about Esther Williams, who had died the previous spring but whose presence still filled their small apartment in Crown Heights. She had been a domestic worker who spent her evenings studying Hebrew, a woman who faced down discrimination in both the black community and Jewish spaces, yet somehow emerged with her dignity intact. She used to say that when people tell you that you can't be both things, the revolutionary act isn't becoming neither. It's insisting on being both. Like, maybe the line of flight isn't about escaping identity, but about multiplying it. "That's a really important distinction," Professor Goldstein said. "Deleuze isn't advocating for the destruction of all identity, but for the multiplication of possible connections. Your grandmother sounds like she understood something crucial about what he calls becoming minor." After class, Marcus walked through Washington Square Park, thinking about his grandmother's stories. She had met his grandfather, Benjamin Williams, at a civil rights meeting in 1963. Benjamin was a jazz musician from Harlem who had converted to Judaism in the army, finding in Jewish prayers something that resonated with his experience of being an outsider in America. "We weren't trying to fit in anywhere," Esther had told him once. We were trying to create something new. Marcus pulled out his phone and called his mother, Denise, who worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai. "How was philosophy class, baby?" she asked. He could hear the hospital background noise, the constant beeping and chatter that had formed the soundtrack of his childhood. "We talked about lines of flight today," he said. "Made me think about Grandma." "Everything makes you think about Grandma," Denise said gently. "What would she say about lines of flight?" Marcus kicked at fallen leaves, thinking. Probably that she'd been flying all her life, but not away from anything. Toward something. Toward a way of being that didn't exist yet. That sounds about right. She always said the future was something you had to invent, not discover. That evening, Marcus sat in his bedroom in the apartment he shared with his mother and younger sister, trying to write his paper for Professor Goldstein's class. The assignment was to analyze a contemporary political situation through Deleuzian concepts. Most students would probably write about social media or globalization or climate change. But Marcus found himself thinking about his own family's story, 3 generations of people who had refused to accept that they had to choose between different aspects of themselves. He started typing, "Deleuze writes about the body without organs, not an actual body, but a field of intensities and connections that exist before social categories divide it into separate parts. My grandmother, Esther Williams, lived as a body without organs. She refused the social demand that she organize her identity around single categories, black or Jewish, working class or intellectual, traditional or modern. Instead, she created new connections between seemingly incompatible worlds." As he wrote, Marcus began to see how his family's story connected to larger patterns. His grandmother's conversion hadn't been about escaping blackness or fully assimilating into whiteness. It had been about creating what Deleuze might call a minoritarian position, a way of existing that challenged majority assumptions about how identity should work. "The question isn't whether someone like my grandmother really belongs in Jewish spaces or black spaces," he continued. "The question is what new possibilities emerge when someone insists on belonging in both." Around midnight, he paused in his writing and looked out his window at the lights of Brooklyn stretching toward Manhattan. Somewhere out there, Professor Goldstein was probably grading papers or having another philosophical argument with her rabbi father. Somewhere out there, other people were wrestling with the spaces between categories, the places where new forms of life might be possible. His phone buzzed, a text from his friend Keisha, who went to Howard University. "How's the fancy philosophy program, still talking about dead white guys?" Marcus smiled and typed back, "Talking about dead French guys who helped me understand living black grandmothers." "That's oddly specific, but somehow makes perfect sense coming from you," she replied. Marcus returned to his paper, but now he was writing not just for a grade, but for his grandmother, for Professor Goldstein, for Keisha, for all the people who lived in the spaces between definitions. He was writing his way toward a line of flight that didn't escape the world, but engaged it more fully. 2 months after his midnight conversation with Sarah, Rabbi David Goldstein stood before his Friday night congregation with a sermon that would either transform his ministry or end it. The sanctuary was fuller than usual. Word had spread that the rabbi was going through some kind of spiritual evolution, and people were curious. Mrs. Chen sat in her usual spot, 3rd row left. The Goldberg twins flanked their parents in the middle section. Marcus Williams had accepted his invitation to attend, bringing his mother.